Okay, so I'm really, really excited about tonight's call because we've got two brilliant writers joining us whose thinking and writing have really helped inform Just Treatment's analysis and thinking for our youth mental health campaign. So much of the way that we still talk and think about mental health is based on individual explanations of someone having something wrong with them. So you might have a chemical imbalance, you can have a personality disorder, you can have OCD. And at Just Treatment, we think it's crucial to not only look to the individual biochemical explanations of mental illness, and I think it's important to acknowledge that, of course, there is truth in these for lots of people and use in these for lots of people, but that also that they leave a lot out. And in particular, they don't talk about the conditions within which mental illness or madness occur. And these are conditions which may be intolerable for lots of people, where the toll of trying to survive is really heavy. And for many people, it's simply too heavy. These unbearable conditions are created by the society in which we live, which, as we all know, is a capitalist society, which is dominated by individualism, by precarity, by unsustainability, and by oppression. And if we don't look at capitalism when we're thinking about mental health, we think that we're leaving a really important part of the picture out. So yeah, that's why we're really delighted to be joined by Micha Frazer-Carroll and Tori Tsui tonight, who have drawn on their own lived experience to write about this so powerfully and so insightfully. So tonight we're really lucky to hear extracts from both of their books, and then I'm really looking forward to having a discussion with some of their ideas. There will be time for your questions after we've had a structured discussion. So please, as we go along through the call, stick your questions in the chat button. We will be collating them and we will try and get through as many as possible as we go. Okay, so first up, we're going to hear from Micha, whose book, Mad World, The Politics of Mental Health, is a really incredible exploration of these themes. And if you're interested in discussions of mental health, I would really urge you to read this book or to listen to the audiobook, because yeah, I just found it so fascinating and illuminating. So yeah, over to Micha.
Thank you so much for that very generous introduction. So hi everyone, yeah, it's great to be on this call and to see so many of you here today. My name is Micha. My background is as a journalist, but I've also been involved in campaigning and organizing kind of around various different movements. I'm quite interested in anti-racism, but also obviously mental health and disability justice. And last year I wrote this book, which is called Mad World, The Politics of Mental Health. And the aim of this book was really to get at some of the themes that we've already touched on. So the idea that the world that we live in is severely impacting the amount of mental distress, mental illness, madness. Obviously, terminology is very complicated and there are lots of different terms and different language I'm sure we'll use today. But that the world that we live in is impacting this, but simultaneously also forces like capitalism shape what we even think of as what's sometimes called madness or mental illness. And also, crucially, this capitalist society that we live in shapes treatment as well, and the care or lack thereof that people receive when they reach out to, for example, mental health services when they're experiencing distress. So a lot of this book talks about the capitalist economic system, and I wanted to read a little extract. I've estimated it will be between 5 and 7 minutes, just for those who it might be useful to know how long I'm going to speak for. And yeah, I'll get going. I've pulled out the bits that I think are most relevant to the topics in this conversation. So this first bit is from the introduction. Capitalism, a system characterized by private ownership, wage labor, competition, and the pursuit of profit, harms each and every one of us. It separates us, workers, from our work, forces us to choose between inhumane working conditions or death, pushes people into dangerous living conditions and houselessness, destroys our environment, sanctions and normalizes all kinds of death, forces the unemployed into murderous benefit systems and social institutions, and allows a limited few to accumulate more wealth than they could ever need. Around 10% of the world lives in extreme poverty. These conditions are largely inflicted on women, young people, children, and people living in the global south. 100 million people are estimated to be homeless worldwide, and as many as 1.6 billion lack adequate housing. More than 60% of workers worldwide are in temporary, part-time, or short-term jobs in which wages are falling. Neoliberal austerity has seen healthcare, youth centres, housing budgets, and benefits slashed, depriving us from access to bodily autonomy, community, safety, dignity, and joy. This is the context in which depression has become the leading global cause of disability. Under these conditions, life is not only unfulfilling for many, but also unlivable. On a psychological and interpersonal level, capitalism affects all of us. It infiltrates and corrupts how we fundamentally think about one another. The insidious logics of extraction, exploitation, scarcity, and competition impact how we talk, befriend, date, and otherwise interact with one another. Capitalism birthed even the most commonplace social structures in which we distribute care, abuse, and resources. It is no coincidence that the Western capitalist nuclear family unit is the institution that psychoanalysts have long located at the epicenter of our neuroses. Intimate relationships and marriages, another normalized economic unit, often produce trauma. In this sense, and many others, capitalism fractures community, laying the foundations for isolation and abuse. Its allied systems, for example, white supremacy and ableism, also trap and harm us on a psychic level. The body worker Lisa Fannin describes capitalism itself as a dissociative state. She says, many of us were made to sit still for long periods of time at school, engaging predominantly with our rational minds, when we might have had strong impulses to run or move or dream. As Fannin observes, we all have to find internal survival mechanisms to escape our harmful conditions from an early age. Few of us know how it feels to genuinely be free, to be self-directed, to live without fear of punishment or violence, and to really flourish. We must all dissociate to some extent, smiling for our employers and crying about it in therapy, tolerating daily microaggressions and venting about it within our communities, exhaling when we finally arrive home and feel able to remove our mask. Few of us can safely and fully exist in the world, and the mental toll catches up with us. And then I just wanted to read really briefly from a chapter that I have on capitalist work. And this kind of looks at various different dimensions of capitalist work, including how it harms us physically, how it harms us mentally, but also how it shapes what we think of as mental health or mental illness. And just a note, this extract talks a bit about suicide. Since the days of the Industrial Revolution, the production line has been dangerous. In the 18th and 19th centuries, as manufacturing processes changed in nature and demand, society saw a proliferation of new diseases that were particular to the conditions of work. Lung disease, dermatitis, and phossy jaw, the death of cells in the jaw due to phosphorus exposure in the match industry. Images of Victorian Britain are always peppered with images of disability. People who were injured by explosions in coal mines, children who lost limbs or fingers to high-speed and uncontrollable machinery, people disabled by smog and disease in cramped cities organized around the factory. However, in the mid-19th century, the theorist Karl Marx also began to turn his attention to the psychic and relational injuries that result from the capitalist mode of production in his theory of alienation. Marx observed that workers were estranged from their work. They were estranged from the things they produced, from their co-workers, and from themselves. Under the capitalist system, workers only produced because they would die if they didn't, and the terms with which they engaged with work were dictated by external forces: the boss, the boss's boss, the board, and the markets. Workers therefore became fundamentally dissociated from the capacity for joy and connection, a psychic wound that accompanied each of the physical ones sustained during work. Although the last 2 centuries have seen conditions of production shift across time and space, it remains true that capitalist work harms our entire body minds through exploitation and the quest for profit. As the activity that occupies the greatest proportion of our waking hours, work is naturally connected to our emotional and psychic experience of the world. In the year 2020 to 2021, 822,000 British workers reported work-related stress, depression, and anxiety. The previous year, 17.9 million working days were lost to these forms of work-related distress. The highest proportion of working days lost to any work-related health concern. 79% of UK workers report that they have suffered from burnout. Precarious work is closely associated with mental distress. Hospitality workers experience the highest reported levels of workplace stress out of any industry, and those who rely on tips are at particularly high risk of depression and sleep problems. Many of the world's most physically hazardous manufacturers also have equally damning track records for worker mental health. At Foxconn's factory in Shenzhen, China, where Apple iPhones are manufactured, 17 workers took their lives over a 5-year period, with a number of other reported suicide attempts. It's not a good place for human beings, one former worker told The Guardian. During another 5-year period in the US, there were at least 189 calls to emergency services regarding suicide attempts, suicidal thoughts, and other mental health episodes from Amazon warehouses. Jace Crouch, an employee who had an emotional crisis on the job, told the Daily Beast, "It's mentally taxing to do the same task super fast for 10-hour shifts, 5 days a week," also saying that employee breakdowns were a regular occurrence. And now, just to close, I might skip to the end of the chapter, which just talks a little bit about kind of things we can do to resist. It is crucial that we organise with other workers, as well as those excluded and disabled by work. Those in the latter group have attempted to resist mental health initiatives that only serve the purposes of profit. In 2016, the Mental Health Resistance Network called the demonstration in Streatham, South London, to resist the introduction of cognitive behavioural therapy in their local job centre. They described this as compulsory treatment, with the goal of forcing mad or mentally ill people back into work. In an open letter, they wrote, "We should not be put under pressure to look for work unless we feel capable. The competitive, profit-driven, and exploitative nature of the modern workplace is not suitable for people whose mental health is fragile." Forms of resistance like this are rehearsals for the future we would like to see, one in which workers and non-workers alike have autonomy over our health and are able to define what health actually looks like. I'll stop there.
Amazing. Thank you, Misha. That was a real privilege to hear you read that. Yeah, I think you just speak so powerfully about, the intolerable conditions of capitalism that I was talking about at the start and the psychic impacts that has. And also, yeah, I love that section on resistance as well. And hopefully that's something we'll be able to touch on more in the discussion. But yeah, so I can see that people have got their hands up. So we are going to come to questions, but that's going to come later in the call. So if you've got questions, please stick them in the chat and we will collate them and come to them later in the call. Thanks. But now I'm going to hand over to Tori. So Tori's book here, it's not just you, how to navigate eco-anxiety and the climate crisis. So Tori writes with incredible insight about both climate change and mental health, and unpacks the many nuances in how enmeshed and interrelated they are. So yeah, really looking forward to hearing you read us some of your words, Tori. Over to you.
Thank you so much. So yeah, as Emma mentioned, I wrote a book which kind of looks at the mental health and the climate crisis and how it intersects. I use the term eco-anxiety on the front cover, and I often joke to people that it's a bit of a catfish. I think eco-anxiety was a good starting point for people to explore this topic, but in essence, it is a book about anti-capitalism and how capitalism is bad for our mental well-being, but for a lot of folks, I think it can be a bit of a jump to get to that sort of understanding. And so I wanted to use a lens that I felt was relatively accessible in the environmental space. So I'm going to read a section from a chapter called "It's Not Just Commodified Care," and it's all about how neoliberal capitalism has kind of ushered in and marketed solutions to mental ill health that only uphold the system in place. I want to caveat that I talk about medication and critique it to a certain degree, but I'm also someone who's on medication and benefits from it greatly. So I want to imbue that kind of nuance and, you know, really encourage people to read about this topic in their own time and come to their own conclusions. But it's essentially a space to unpack the over-individualization and critique some of the solutions that we have been provided with. So yeah, the swift introduction of the psychotropic drugs to psychiatric clinical practice between the 1950s and 80s is often referred to as the psychopharmacological drug revolution. During this time, many pharmaceutical companies began enthusiastically marketing these drugs to mental health practitioners, and still to this day, they are considered a first line of treatment for mental ailments. Psychiatry in the 20th century was largely characterized by a reductionist understanding of mental illness, with monocausal frameworks for understanding the root cause of mental dysfunction. From the Freudian unconscious to the human genome to dysfunctional neurobiology, psychiatric drugs were seen as a no-brainer for addressing underlying neurological imbalances in the mind. But little has actually changed, and the medicated route for mental illness is only becoming more prevalent. In Britain, more than 20% of adults take a psychiatric drug, which is a 500% increase since the 1980s. Between 2021 and 2022 alone, 8.3 million people received an antidepressant drug, and these numbers are still growing. Despite the rise in the prescription of drugs, the prevalence of mental health issues hasn't gone down, nor has it plateaued. In fact, it has increased, and the number of people who have recovered since going on drugs has apparently decreased too. When researching for this book, I came across the work of Professor Martin Harrow, who investigated the impact of long-term drug use on patients with schizophrenia. His findings revealed that those who used medications short-term actually fared better than those who remained on them. This included a cohort of severely ill patients who did better without medication than those who were less severely ill who continued on them. Inspired by Harrow's work, journalist and author Robert Whitaker began compiling research on the impacts of long-term drug use on the prospects of those with major mental disorders, including schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and major depressive disorder. His results reinforced Harrow's findings that those who continue to take drugs long-term do much worse than those who stop taking them. Further independent research has corroborated these findings. Of course, I'm hesitant to make any definitive conclusions about the efficacy of long-term drug use, as I'm no expert in pharmacological sciences, and there are many who will buck the trend, undoubtedly benefiting from them. But these analyses call into question the overarching reductionist framework of biological determinism that dominates the discourse, purporting chemical imbalances as an underlying cause of mental ill health, especially as research has not yet been able to identify sole biological markers that account for specific mental illnesses, which is reflected in the lack of biological testing for diagnostic procedures. More recently, a major review of research from scientists at University College London showed that there is no clear evidence that depression is owed to levels of serotonin or serotonin activity in the brain. While this does not rule out the multiplicity of genetic components and neurotransmitters that influence mental health, it certainly undermines the monocausal narrative that we are fed. This is particularly important to address as researchers say that 85 to 90% of the public believe that depression is owed to chemical imbalances in the brain. But could it be that this overarching belief is no accident? James Davies, author of Sedated: How Modern Capitalism Created Our Mental Health Crisis, argues that the explanatory model of monocausal illness does not serve the diverse realities of people's struggles, nor the importance of lived realities, but rather bolsters its own jurisdiction and economic priorities. As we discussed in the previous chapter, neoliberal capitalism has endowed values of individualism, where success is down to the individual in question rather than what privileges and disadvantages they may possess. In other words, our value as individuals is earned and cultivated, and markers of success, self-esteem, and identity are represented by what we produce and consume. This archetype is characterized by competition, productivity, tenacity, ambitiousness, and work ethic, perhaps the opposite of what someone with low-functioning mental illness may represent. And in the neoliberal world of mental health management, individualism has underscored everything, from where illness comes from to how we might best rectify it. From antidepressants to cognitive behavioral therapy, some solutions are aimed at managing symptoms with little regard for the root causes. Mark Fisher himself was a critic of the chemico-biologicalization of mental illness, wherein the notion that suffering is owed to brain chemistry is a reinforcement of capital's drive towards atomistic individualization. But what about the psychiatric realm at large? Author of Psychiatric Hegemony, Bruce Cohen writes that psychiatry is a depoliticized system of control that emerged during the Industrial Revolution. In doing so, it served to create a disciplined society and workforce, and as a means for dealing with the disruptive. He explains how 19th century asylums work to instill a work ethic in a reluctant cohort and argues that most treatments are aimed at modifying unwanted behavior instead of curing medical illness. By and large, what we see is a mental health realm which upholds the demands of neoliberal capitalism. Intriguingly, Davies notes that during the same year that Ronald Reagan became US president and began implementing neoliberal economic policies to boost worker productivity, the DSM reclassified occupational underperformance to be an indicator of mental illness, no doubt the perfect opportunity for pharmaceuticals to aid in ushering people back to work. And since the 1980s, the profits of the pharmaceutical companies have ballooned. It is estimated that in 2020, the global psychotropic drug market was worth around $36.77 billion US dollars and is projected to reach $58.91 billion by 2031. Such is the case that we are seeing Western understandings of psychiatry being ushered into all corners of the globe. For instance, US pharmaceutical industries have started tapping into Chinese markets by sponsoring Cantonese DSM-6 manuals and marketing the drug Prozac as Baiyuzhi, translating to undoer of all kinds of worries and sorrows. But how has the mental health sector been able to achieve a collusion between psychiatry, state, and beyond? In his book, James Davies explains that unlike other disciplines with deep historical roots, the mental health field is rather flexible, adapting to the demands of the economic paradigm in question. Without a defined biological basis for mental illness, the basis of evidence is easily adapted to the direction of the powers in question. Indeed, diagnoses outlined by the DSM leave much room for investigation, as it has been under fire for lack of empirical integrity. In 2019, a study from the University of Liverpool declared that psychiatric diagnoses in the DSM were scientifically meaningless and created an illusion of certainty that has the potential to exacerbate stigma and prejudice. Instead, they encourage practitioners to consider the impact of life experiences on mental health. Their remarks were frank, stating, "Perhaps it's time we stop pretending that medical-sounding labels contribute anything to our understanding of the complex causes of human distress or of what kind of help we need when distressed." Davies also argues that psychiatry's medical symbolism imbues an air of authority which reinforces its validity. Words like disorder and illness recast suffering as a medical problem that can only be addressed by the confines of the psychopathological framework. Bruce Cohen even cautions that the psychiatric discourse poses an expert knowledge on the mind, but produces little actual evidence to back up its assertions. But the power imbalance still remains, and he argues that psychiatry bolsters a hegemony that benefits the elite, as medicalization helps legitimize class relations. As philosopher Michael Foucault says in Madness and Civilization, power ascribes who is considered sane and who is considered mad. Cohen argues that the biomedical ideology has become the dominant solution to what are social and economic conditions of late-stage capitalism. What has resulted is a mental health sector that puts the market's needs for growth above people's wellness, and while this collusion may not be intentional, the mental health sector has arisen as a result of the difficulty of surviving under neoliberal economics, which see restorative health and care as deprioritized. Much of the rhetoric around mental health sees any deviance from the neoliberal, patriarchal, heteronormative, white, able-bodied, straight-sized archetype to be a symbolic of an illness owed to the individual as opposed to the systems at play. And when people react so adversely to the world around them through causing disruption, they may be locked away and detained for further treatment. Many of us within the climate movement have seen how the police use Section 136 of the Mental Health Act to detain activists protesting against injustice who are suspected of being mentally ill in public places. Fisher, Davies, and Cohen all argue that it is this pathologization of the self that prevents any possibility of politicization, wherein any systemic cause is ruled out. As Sana Asan says, will 6 sessions of CBT designed to target unhelpful thinking styles really be effective for someone who doesn't know how they're going to feed their family for another week? Antidepressants aren't going to eradicate the relentless racial trauma a Black man is surviving in a hostile workplace. And branding people who are enduring sexual violence with a psychiatric disorder in a world where 2 women a week are murdered in their own home does nothing to keep them safe. Unsurprisingly, mindfulness isn't helping children who are navigating poverty, peer pressure, and competitive exam-driven school conditions where bullying and social media harm are rife. In the system, our struggles and distress get labelled as illness with the solutions that force us to adapt to oppressive systems. So what is the alternative to the psychiatric realm? Well, in a neoliberal economy, the market is said to fill the gaps left by the state. So we're sold the idea that the antidote to our problems is the capitalistic system itself. This comes in the form of a burgeoning self-care market, which is projected to be worth $1.5 trillion by 2026. This is capitalist realism at play. Capitalism creates problems and then markets the solutions back to us. Buying material goods and experiences is good for capitalism and bad for the environment, signifying that we are a source of profit when in distress. So much like green capitalism, care has been so commodified, co-opted, and repurposed that it does little to rectify the issue at the root. I think that's about 10 minutes, so I'm going to stop there. But I actually look at, in the rest of the chapter, how even so-called quote-unquote radical forms of mental health care that we're seeing being popularized in society are also being commodified. Like when we look at sort of spiritual and spiritual use of, say, like psychedelics, and I critique a lot of the way that actually a lot of interest in psychedelics has been fueled by the desire to usher people back into the workforce, and that's been used as a framework with which to fund this kind of research. So yeah, commodified care is unfortunately something that permeates even so-called more radical and innovative treatments that people talk about. So yeah.
Brilliant. Thanks, Tori. Such a brilliant explanation of what is left out in the biomedical explanations. Really great. So now we're going to go into the discussion. So I'm going to just ask Micha and Tori a few questions, and Just Treatment's senior youth mental health senior organizer might also chip in with some of their reflections on the extracts that were read out. But to start, and then don't worry, we are going to come to your questions. We'll have about 15 minutes of us chatting, and then we'll have 15 minutes of questions from all of you. And Ala, I know, is busy collating your questions, so we will try and get through as many as possible. Yeah, so to start off with, I just wanted to sort of follow on from what you were saying, Tori, and really ask you to think a bit about when we rely on just biochemical, biomedical, monocausal explanation of mental illness, what gets left out in terms of our ability to organize politically? Like, what are we losing as a movement in terms of our ability to look across struggle and to organize collectively when we only focus on like those biomedical explanations?
Yeah, thank you. I think so. The biomedical model of mental illness, and it's partly why I kind of say take everything with a pinch of salt and do your own research, is that there are people who have genetic and biological predispositions to mental ill health, if we want to call it that. And it is important to discern that, like, there are drugs that really do help people, and they've helped me in my life as well. And also, I think I operate from this perspective of the social model of disability, that the world around us is disabling. And for many of us, accessing drugs is a survival mechanism that is a lot easier to access than, say, trying to radically change the system overnight, which is quite impossible to do alone. And so I do feel like, I want to critique it, but I also want to imbue this nuance, as I've mentioned. When it comes to maybe how it discourages collective organizing, I think it's because we're fed this narrative so strongly, which is why I wanted to critique it as like an antithesis to just how much people focus on it. Because what I found that it does is it it allows us to just focus on this one thing that scientists are talking about, which medical professionals are talking about. And for me, it completely detracted from the reality that actually I grew up in a very traumatic environment, and I experienced systemic oppression at the hands of the system that I lived in as well. And I hadn't thought at all about that being something that contributed to my ill mental health, because I thought, well, they told me I had a chemical imbalance and therefore it's a me problem. And as a result, I didn't seek out the sort of community that actually addressed those systemic oppressive forces at the root. Whereas now I try to advocate more for this collective sort of, collective organizing, as you've mentioned, route, because I feel like it's very nice to be around fellow mad people, for starters. You feel very seen and heard. And also, secondly, I feel like we're actually tackling things radically, and to tackle things radically means at the root, it has such negative connotations. It has connotations associated with violence and anger, and, you know, the way that the far right has categorized so many activists in this space. But actually, it's looking at the problem itself. And one of the solutions to, say, eco-anxiety, for instance, or the mental ill health that comes with the climate crisis, that I argue is actually taking the fossil fuel industry head on, because we're told that it's our eco-anxiety which is our problem, and therefore we have to find ways to mitigate it. And I'm like, well, actually, I'm kept awake at night. I'm really anxious about the state of the planet, because there are literal, you know, profit-driven institutions and industries that are completely decimating our world and killing people in the process. So yeah, I think that there is a bias, unfortunately, in the popular discourse that encourages us to think about it individually, and that actually prevents us from thinking outside the box and connecting with people to organize collectively.
Yeah, completely. And Micha, I could bring you in here, perhaps to maybe to touch a bit on the nuance that Tori was just speaking about, because I mean, you write really brilliantly on that. I think when you say, as well as resisting the kind of dominance of biomedical explanations, we also need to resist just switching into explanations that rely only on social factors. And I think you have a lovely phrase, which is that, you know, the ideas around different causes of mental illness can be held in solidarity, not in competition. I really like that. I don't know if you could unpack that a bit more.
Definitely, yeah. This is something that I delved into quite a lot in the book, because I feel like when we get into like more political and social discussions of mental health, I think there's a tendency sometimes to do kind of what the academic Hal Spandler has described as like social reductionism in response to biological reductionism. And I really like the nuance that like I can hear Tori holding, which is like the holding at the same time the fact that the social world shapes how we experience distress, but simultaneously things like medication, things like biological explanations can be really powerful for some people, and can be the dominant kind of way that some of us explain our experiences of distress, or as we might call them, madness or illness. And I think one thing that I try and get at is, I mean, kind of building on what Tori's spoken about, is this thing of the fact that, so Mark Fisher talks about this idea of the privatization of stress taking place in the 1980s, as Tori mentions, around the time of Thatcher. And it's, you know, you see this privatization of state services, but simultaneously he argues that you see the concept of stress, or as mental illness as an individual problem that originates from within the brain and within our biology, as being kind of the dominant explanation. And the journalist Tim Adams also kind of talks about this. He looks at statistics of days lost to strikes. And then as the kind of anti-strike legislation comes in under Margaret Thatcher, then the decrease in strike days and the simultaneous increase, exponential increase in stress-related sick days off of work. And he talks about this as a clear kind of explanation or clear demonstration of that concept of privatizing stress. As Tori's mentioned, it's not that necessarily the problem has gone away. Actually, it seems that the problem has increased, but we're describing it through individual means. And I think basically like this is the top line for me. And I think that almost like discussions about whether we should see it as an illness or see it as purely social actually kind of can sometimes lose the nuance that when we talk about disability and physical illness as well, lots of the causes of that are also social. So I look in the book, at the example of asthma when you're living in cramped and polluted city conditions, and the fact that actually whether you get the diagnosis of asthma or not, or whether you choose to claim that diagnosis, the conditions, the political conditions of the world are still changing your experience of suffering in your body, or as in my book I describe, the body mind. So I tried to kind of push away from this idea of like it's either all biological or all social, because the reality is that, as you can probably tell from my use of the word body minds, it is a combination of both. Like we can't separate our bodies from the social world that we live in. And actually I think that like we can hold individual autonomy over how we identify, but ultimately I argue that diagnosis can't only be used as a form of liberal identity politics. And this is obviously, identity politics is something that we're hearing critiqued more and more, for example, in the sphere of race and gender. We saw, for example, under the last government, the weaponization of, being of ethnic minority and saying, well, I'm an ethnic minority, so I can't possibly be enacting racist policy. I think that's like a really good example of the weaponization of identity politics. And that's basically what I don't want to see when it comes to diagnosis. I think like you can see it sometimes in pockets, this thing of like, I am this label or I am that diagnosis, and that's as kind of far as like political analysis goes. And I kind of want to hold on to the idea that regardless of how we identify, whether we choose to embrace diagnosis or reject it, we need to link up with one another and acknowledge that our struggles are all connected, and that we're suffering under a lot of the same systems.
Brilliant, thanks. And I'll just bring in Mai as well here. I don't know whether you just have any reflections from your experience on, the how you hold the different explanations of mental illness.
Yeah, I think something that has come up recently that's been quite interesting when I've been talking to lots of young people who are going to be involved in our campaign is that there seems to be this kind of pipelines that people who were kind of assigned female at birth have gone through in terms of their diagnosis and their journey. And it's so common that I'm meeting kind of people who were diagnosed with personality disorders at kind of the age of 15 to 18, and were subsequently kind of locked in psychiatric units for extended periods of time, and being told that, yeah, that was kind of like individual level of fault and issue with their kind of self and their personality. And I think there's been a real big shift over the past kind of year or so, where a lot of people who are diagnosed with borderline personality disorder are getting re-diagnosed as ADHD, so autistic and ADHD. And I've seen this real sense of empowerment that's come from that. You have all these people who have been told for so much of their life that they are the problem, and they're able to almost have a switch into that kind of social model of disability of being like, I am not the problem, it is the world around me. And I think that I have my own kind of feelings towards diagnoses and kind of that almost like kind of capitalist branding of disorders and kind of disorders which are more in vogue and not. But I think that this switch to this kind of ADHD diagnosis is really bringing people out of this sense of self-blame, and starting to look at it through kind of a different lens, which I think can only be empowering.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks for that, Mai. And this is actually quite a good juncture to bring in one of the questions that's coming on the chat. I think we've had quite a lot of questions around neurodivergency on the chat. I think this is quite a good one to start with. I think it would be hugely beneficial and pertinent to touch on the fact that the world and modern Western living isn't set up for neurodivergence. If you have ADHD, autism, OCD, you'll find yourself at odds with a world built for neurotypicals. And that's from Di. And then a question from Maria. How should autistics get real support as opposed to feeling ganged up on by all services? I don't know whether Maya or anyone else has any comments or responses to that.
I'll touch on it briefly. I do identify with having autism and ADHD. And then when I kind of really get into the nitty-gritty aspects of it with fellow neurodivergent people, that's when we start like critiquing the ways in which it's popularized and the way that it's portrayed in popular mainstream society. I do agree that the world is not set up for us to thrive. I think it's very unfriendly for a lot of people who are neurodivergent. And I think that, yeah, there's obviously a lot of stigma, that's one thing, but just thinking about accessibility requirements, for instance, is such an afterthought for so many places and spaces and people. And so much of our identity is also kind of turned into either a gimmick or is watered down in a way that makes it more palatable to people and wider society. So for instance, a lot of people who kind of work in the autism space have critiqued the highly sensitive person phenotype because they just say it's a euphemism for being autistic, because autism is seen as a dirty word. And people are like, oh, no, I'm not autistic, I'm just very sensitive. And for me, I was like, oh, yeah, I'm sensitive. And then I started really looking into it. And like a lot of other autistic people, I was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder and, disorders as a child. But actually what I was having were autistic meltdowns. And that just felt so liberating to be like, oh, my God, it's autism. And there's nothing wrong with me. And yeah, I do think that for a lot of my friends and I, we do take solace in recognizing that this world wasn't built for us. But I think I try not to rely on the state to help me with that. I rely on my community and we find each other. And it's just really funny because like, for instance, I went out the other night for Pride and someone just came up to me and was like, are you autistic? And I was like, yeah. And he's like, me too. We just find each other. And I had a great time. And for me, that's kind of part of what brings me autistic joy, is just like finding all the other people who are a bit spicy. And they've been my support network as well. Community care is something I talk about a lot. And so I try not to rely on the state or the systems that are actually harming our communities.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Tori. I'll go to another question from the chat. Would you agree, this is from Francis, would you agree that the introduction of a decent universal wage and a move to a well-being economy would greatly benefit everyone? We could see an increase in creativity and the freedom to live without worry over finances.
Can I ask what's meant by a well-being economy? It sounds good.
I don't know if you want to elaborate briefly, if you want to unmute and elaborate on the well-being economy. Maybe Francis can't unmute right now.
That's okay. I can definitely weigh in on the first part. Like, I think for me, the introduction of a universal basic income is something, yeah, that I've talked about a little bit around the book. And I think that is like a really crucial thing that could definitely alter and change the thing that I discussed, this kind of dichotomy between work or die, which is essentially the implicit bargain that we all are in for under capitalism. Work as we currently experience it is non-consensual, because if you don't work, you risk being pushed into the benefit system, which, as we can see from lots of fantastic work and projects, like, for example, the Deaths by Welfare project, which was done in collaboration with Healing Justice London, it shows that system for many people is a death sentence, or again is characterized by a lot of precarity and a lot of fear. and a lot of needing to kind of fill in the gaps to make ends meet. And so I think, yeah, having universal basic income under which people can, like you say, move away from that fear could kind of create this possibility for joy, creativity. I think this concept of, and I talk about it towards the end of the chapter on capitalist work, the idea that we could work because we wanted to, because we loved one another, or because we can when some other people cannot, I think is a really powerful thing. And again, it comes back to that idea of community and community care and producing or laboring for one another rather than laboring for the purposes of profit and capital accumulation, which is currently the way that we labor. So yeah, I think that one thing that's really crucial to remember in that is people who can't work and can't go to work, because I think so often, especially like in leftist spaces, you know, for example, for decades we've heard the Labour Party talk about working people and working families, and how we need to have better policies for hardworking families, but actually that in many ways I see as a bit of sometimes a dog whistle that calls for like the exclusion of disabled people who might be completely excluded from the process of work. So yeah, I'd love for us to all be able to have the resource to mean that work wasn't something that inspired fear or precarity, but was something we could engage with out of love and community.
Yeah, it's I managed to unmute. The well-being economy is part of a movement away from growth towards a degrowth society, where the health and benefits of our communities would be more important, because we can't keep growing forever. We have reached a period where we're at the end of growth, and we have to look at other ways of surviving and moving away from the forms that we've been used to for the past 200 years. And Scotland, Iceland, and New Zealand were all, when it was Nicola Sturgeon, were all meeting up and talking about a move towards well-being rather than a focus on growth and capitalism, and putting the needs of the people, the health, and the happiness of people before money.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks for that explanation. That's really, really helpful. And yeah, a world away from wage labour, I think we could all get behind. Another great question that's come in. What would your advice be when some of our challenges mean that it's very hard to connect with community or find, engage, having trust building or supportive experiences in a community of care? And that's from Han. Anyone want to jump in on that one?
Well, I'm quite struck by this question. I think it's like a really pertinent question, because I think that this is often a thing that, again, like I hear talked about in political spaces. You know, people talk a lot about the power of community and the importance of our communities and community care. But I think it is really crucial to acknowledge, I think it's the disability activist Leah Lakshmi, who talks about the fact that actually the reality is for a lot of people, I think particularly a lot of disabled people, that community can be really hard to foster. And there are a lot of barriers to establishing community in a world that excludes us from the labor market, from, I mean, you know, I think I've mentioned like the impact of austerity on our ability to have community spaces, etc. And so, yeah, I feel like I was kind of sitting with that and thinking in myself, like how I've managed to build community and find community and trust in spite of those barriers. And I think like one thing, I don't know, maybe it feels like too obvious to name, but it's like the internet. And like, for example, what we're doing on this call now, I think the ability, and we saw this during lockdowns, right? The ability for disabled people to actually be like the first to come together and say, well, this is actually how you deal with when you can't physically be in space with one another. This is how we support each other through whatever it might be, care packages or picking up medication for one another and dropping it at each other's doorsteps during times where we can't be together. You know, video calls. And also I think, again, thinking about neurodivergence specifically for me, like I know in autistic communities, like the internet, forums, social media, for all of its sins, is a really powerful space, and is a really powerful space that helps us make sense of our experiences. And I say this a lot about, you know, what people call self-diagnosis, that actually, like, a lot of what we're often talking about is community diagnosis, because a lot of that discussion happens in these kinds of online spaces where people come together and say, oh, you have that experience too, that's something I've been through. And so, yeah, I think I'm thinking a lot about that as like a way of kind of building community and building trust. But I also think there are things that we can probably do better. Yeah, I might stop there.
Great, thanks.
Emma, can I add something really quickly to that point? So I think also it's worth noting the kind of impact that community care has on the community as well, in terms of when people are kind of really unwell. So I'm thinking about myself, like I've been in hospital for the past 2 years. There were points where kind of my community was caring for me, but it wasn't adequate enough to the level that I needed, as I was so unwell. And so I think that kind of community care is so important and so integral, and those links to the community need to be kept. But I think there is also an element of there needs to be something more, and I don't think anything more is being provided by kind of state at the moment, and kind of I really hope it does, and that's what we're fighting for. But there does need to be a point where that pressure can be taken off community, when people are kind of so unwell, but not taken out of community, kind of held within a space where community can still be accessed.
Yeah, thanks, Mel. Really beautifully put. I'm going to go for facilitator's privilege now to ask the last question, and I'm going to ask all of you to respond to this in turn, if that's okay. Just to ask you, yeah, how right now we can begin to organise for the kind of care or treatment that we'd like to see outside of capitalism. Yeah, just if you had any thoughts on that. Just anyone who wants to start off, just jump in, but I will come to all of you on it.
Well, I will start with a plug of, if you are under 30 and have experience of kind of madness or mental ill health, we at Just Treatment are running our kind of youth mental health campaign, where we're going to create a manifesto, a radical manifesto, which I don't think has been, which kind of hasn't at the moment been adopted by some of the kind of larger mental health organisations. And I think bringing something to the space that is quite radical will be important. And it's just a really nice way for young people to get engaged. And young people is under 30. It's going to get older and older as we get older, but at the moment it's under 30.
Thanks, Mai. Yeah, it's a generous definition of young people. And yeah, that was the plug I was hoping you would get in. Tori or Micha?
I love that definition of young people, because I was saying yesterday I'm 29, so it's great for me because it means that I'm a young person, even though I don't feel that young these days. I think broadly in the book, I mean, I talk a lot about how under Margaret Thatcher, she when she like shut down what were once called mental hospitals or lunatic asylums, which were peppered all across Britain, she kind of promised this policy called care in the community, which sounds really nice, but I argue didn't really materialize. And I think that is like a crucial kind of second part of when we talk about abolition or deinstitutionalization. That crucial second part is actually putting support for people in the community and in the society that we live in. And so I think thinking about what genuine community care looks like, rather than what I would argue under capitalism is what we have mostly seen is the warehousing and kind of disciplining and punishment of people who experience madness or mental ill health. I talk about a few different examples in the book, like crisis houses, which are kind of non-coercive, often kind of houses that are on residential streets that allow people to kind of just get refuge at if they are in crisis, but also peer support. I'm sure many people in this call will be familiar with the importance of initiatives that don't come from this kind of top-down approach, but actually come from a place of, you know, as I was saying before, I've been through this thing and I can relate to something that you're going through, and how can we help one another without entrenched power dynamics. there are various different groups kind of talking about how we can implement support plans. So, you know, sitting down with family and friends and saying, if I ever get to a point in crisis, like, these are the things that I would want. These are the kinds of medications I'd be comfortable with, the kinds of services I'd be comfortable engaging with. I think that's a really important example of community care. But also more broadly, you know, I think we often talk in the mental health space about potential alternatives, but when we're talking about alternatives, we're often talking about when people are already in crisis. I think one of the most significant alternatives actually is prevention. And I think that healthcare begins at prevention. And I guess that's what we've been touching on throughout this call, the fact that the world we live in leads so many people to sickness and suffering. And actually, if we radically altered the conditions of white supremacy, you know, the climate crisis, poverty and inequality, we might find, or would most likely find, that a large amount of suffering that we see in the world could be prevented or radically reduced.
Yeah, thanks, Micha.
I agree with all of the points that have been made, and I think something that touch on is just education as well in our schools about these kinds of issues and about not necessarily crisis management, but I think so much of our education and what is popularized in society also seeks to individualize our behavior to the point where we feel like we don't owe each other compassion and community. And I do agree as well that so often community is this kind of arbitrary term in many ways that isn't necessarily the solution, but it is one thing when applied practically with actual support from the state that can be really, really powerful. But something that I think is important to recognize is that even with the education of what it means to support people, if we're not actually changing the material conditions of society, no one actually has capacity to support one another. So there are people who have the sort of politics that are similar to mine, but their capacity or their praxis is very much limited by the confines of the system. So people who are also struggling themselves are really struggling to juggle everything else on top of trying to take care of their own well-being, let alone someone else who is in crisis. So yeah, education is one aspect, but we really need that sort of infrastructure. We need to radically change the way that society is run, which means divesting from a world where you have to work in order to put food on the table, or like have housing, which should be basic human rights. And then when you start freeing up people's capacities for not having to think about certain things, that's actually when we can start to instill this kind of level of care that's really effective. But yeah, I just wanted to add those thoughts as well.
Yeah, great, brilliant. I mean, how to do care when we're living in a capitalist society. I mean, I think both of you write brilliantly on your description of how asylums came about with the Industrial Revolution, and people having to move to harsh factory working conditions and no longer having the ability to offer people care in the home anymore. Lots more that we could be thinking and talking about, but we are at time, sadly. Thank you so much to everyone for your questions, and sorry we only got to a few. Time was very short. I'm just going to address one myself, which is asking about why the Just Treatment campaign is only for young people and not for older people. And yes, you know, we obviously at Just Treatment, we completely understand that the mental health crisis does not just affect young people, it obviously affects people of all ages. But you know, as we started deciding what we were going to do on this campaign, you know, we were aware that there's just a huge growth in mental illness among young people. And also just some of the like very individualistic campaigns and kind of stigma awareness campaigns that were sort of targeted young people. We just felt like it could be really powerful at this moment to bring together a group of young people to work on that. But of course, very much aware that it goes across all ages, and there are loads of opportunities within the campaign for people of any age to get involved and to to be working with everyone. So yeah, don't feel that you're excluded at all just because the focus is on youth mental health. So yeah, now I'm going to hand over to Mai, who's going to wrap things up for us. Thanks, Mai.
Yeah, so firstly, just I want to say a massive thanks to Micha and Tori for kind of coming along and talking and reading from your books and kind of bringing your insights. It's been so interesting to talk to you guys, and I'm sure we all have a lot more to say to each other as well, kind of as our paths will cross in the future. And also just a massive thank you to Emma for kind of like hosting and being so knowledgeable and great. So firstly, I just want to end by flagging two things. So if you want to learn more about the Youth Mental Health Campaign, you can sign up to Just Treatment's mailing list, and I think the link is in the chat. Yes, the link is in the chat. And secondly, our next Youth Mental Health online call, so similar to this, will be taking place on the 11th of September, and we'll be looking at the school system and mental health. And I'm sure there'll be lots of talks about the kind of metric of productivity in mental health, as we kind of touched on today. So yeah, thank you very much, everyone, and